Brandon and Julia are supposedly standing one decision away from divorce, but the most explosive part of this 90-day style storyline is not the breakup rumor at all, because buried underneath the arguments is a $500,000 number that changes the meaning of almost everything. At first, 500,000 sounds like the kind of secret that makes people assume somebody hid money, moved assets, or planned an exit without telling the other person, but that is exactly where this story becomes more complicated. Julia is not staring at a hidden bank account, and Brandon is not secretly sitting on a pile of cash. The real shock is that both of them have been talking about the same future while believing it meant completely different things, and by the time that misunderstanding finally comes into the open, Julia is already asking whether staying married means giving up too much control over her own life. Brandon thinks they're fighting about money, Julia thinks they are fighting about freedom, and neither realizes yet that the divorce conversation is about to expose something even more uncomfortable. Julia becomes frustrated with how often their future seems to depend on plans that are always almost ready, almost affordable, or almost happening. She wants a clearer sense of where they are going, what belongs to them as a couple, what she can build independently, and whether the life they keep discussing is actually moving forward. Brandon sees those questions as pressure, because from his perspective he has been trying to create stability rather than avoid commitment. Every time Julia asks why something has not happened yet, Brandon hears criticism of the work he believes he is already doing, while every time Brandon says they need more time, Julia hears another reason she is supposed to wait. Neither response sounds outrageous by itself, but together they create a pattern where every practical conversation quietly turns into a relationship argument, and that pattern becomes dangerous once the mysterious 500,000 figure enters the picture. The $500,000 number comes from several pieces of a possible future being added together rather than one secret account. There is projected property value, possible equity, business ideas, savings goals, potential income from public opportunities, and the kind of long-term financial growth that can look impressive when somebody puts every optimistic number on one page. Brandon sees that total as a future target, something that could exist if the right decisions are made over several years. But Julia initially hears it as evidence that their financial position is much stronger than she was led to believe. That difference is enormous because one person is talking about what might eventually be worth 500,000 while the other is asking why they're still living like every major choice has to be delayed. Julia immediately wants to know what part is real now, what part is projected, what part depends on family decisions, and what part she would actually control if their marriage fell apart. The real problem is not whether the 500,000 exists today, because the number clearly does not represent $500,000 sitting in spendable cash. The problem is that Julia suddenly realizes how much of their imagined future depends on things she cannot personally control. If part of the value comes from property decisions, family involvement, future business growth, and income opportunities that may or may not happen, then the impressive total is not the same thing as personal security. Brandon looks at the number and sees proof that patience could eventually pay off, while Julia looks at the same number and sees another future she is being asked to trust before she can touch it. This is where the argument stops sounding like simple greed or simple secrecy, because Julia is not saying, "Give me half of 500,000. She is asking, "If everything we are building depends on tomorrow, what do I actually have today?" Brandon does not have an answer that satisfies her, and that silence becomes much louder than the number itself. That question hits a nerve because Brandon believes Julia is ignoring everything they have already built together, and he starts explaining that financial security is not created by making emotional decisions every time someone feels frustrated. Julia understands the logic, but she refuses to accept the idea that patience should always mean she has less independence in the present. She points out that there is a difference between building slowly together and waiting for somebody else to decide when you are finally secure enough to move forward. That is the first moment where the real conflict becomes obvious, because Brandon is protecting a plan while Julia is protecting her ability to survive if the plan fails. They are no longer debating one number. They are debating what marriage is supposed to guarantee when two people have different levels of control over the future, and that is when the word divorce enters the conversation for the first time. Julia asks Brandon whether they would still choose each other if they were starting from where they are now, without the history, without the promises, and without the pressure to prove the relationship was worth everything they have already invested. Brandon is stunned by the question because he thought they were discussing finances, not whether the marriage should continue, but Julia tells him the finances are only showing them a problem that was already there. She wants more control over her work, her income, her living situation, and the decisions that affect her future, while Brandon feels like every request for independence is being framed as preparation to leave him. He asks whether she is already thinking about divorce, and Julia does not give him the clean answer he wants. She says she is thinking about what happens if nothing changes, which sounds softer at first, but emotionally it is much more serious, because she is no longer only arguing for a better marriage. She is imagining an alternative. That is where everyone around them begins making the situation worse, because once a couple starts using words like separation, independence, assets, and lawyers, people immediately jump to the ending before the couple has even decided what the middle looks like. Julia has a private legal consultation simply to understand what separation could mean, what questions she should ask, and how financial expectations might be treated if the relationship ever reached that point. She does not sign final divorce papers, she does not secretly end the marriage, and she does not walk away with $500,000, but Brandon hears about the consultation and reacts as though she has already placed one foot outside the door. To him, speaking with a lawyer means Julia has started planning against him. To Julia, learning her options means she is finally refusing to remain uninformed. Both interpretations make emotional sense, and that is exactly why the conversation becomes so explosive, because knowledge feels like protection to one person and betrayal to the other. The emotional temperature rises again when family opinions enter the situation, because Brandon is no longer processing the crisis only as a husband. He is also hearing concerns from people who believe he could be financially exposed if the marriage ends badly. Nobody is proof that Julia is chasing money, but one careless question changes the entire mood. Would Julia still be this determined to leave if the future really was worth $500,000? Julia hears that and immediately feels insulted because it turns every concern she has raised about control, stability, and independence into a story about money. She tells him that if money were her only goal, staying and waiting for the optimistic future would make more sense than leaving before it exists. That point lands hard, because suddenly the $500,000 figure looks less like a motive and more like a trap both of them have been projecting different fears onto. Julia stops trying to win every argument and begins thinking practically about what an independent life would require. She considers separate income, her own professional plans, a living arrangement she can afford without depending on anyone else, and a future where every major decision does not require several people to agree before she can move. Brandon notices the shift immediately because Julia is no longer asking, "How do we fix this?" every 5 minutes. She is asking, "What do I need if we cannot?" And that second question terrifies him because she can answer it without his permission. He accuses her of emotionally checking out, while Julia says she is finally doing the planning he always tells her adults are supposed to do. The irony is brutal. Brandon spent the entire money argument defending long-term planning, but once Julia begins creating a long-term plan that does not automatically include him, planning suddenly feels like a threat. Then Brandon asks the one question that cuts through every argument about lawyers, property, family, and money. If the $500,000 disappeared from the conversation completely, would Julia still want to leave? Julia does not answer immediately, and that hesitation tells Brandon more than a fast yes or no ever could. She finally says the money is not the reason she is questioning the marriage, but the argument around it exposed how differently they see security. Brandon thinks security means building something valuable over time, even if the benefits are delayed, while Julia thinks security means knowing she can stand on her own today without waiting for a future that depends on other people. Brandon asks whether that means she no longer trusts him, and Julia says she trusts that he loves her, but she is no longer sure love automatically creates the kind of partnership she needs. That distinction changes the entire story, because now the problem cannot be solved by simply proving that nobody hid $500,000. For the first time, Brandon begins to understand that Julia is not threatening divorce because she discovered one financial secret. She is questioning whether their marriage gives both of them equal confidence in the future. He tries to explain that he never intended the $500,000 estimate to sound like guaranteed money, and he admits that talking about projected value without clearly separating it from present reality created expectations he should have addressed earlier. Julia accepts that explanation, but she tells him the misunderstanding only matters because it connected to years of frustration about when their next chapter would actually begin. She does not need him to produce a giant check, and she does not expect every plan to work exactly as predicted, but she needs decisions that make her feel like an active partner rather than someone waiting to benefit later. Brandon finally hears the difference, yet understanding it does not magically repair the damage, because Julia has already taken the step he feared most. She has imagined a complete life without him, and once someone can see that life clearly, staying becomes a choice instead of a dependency. Earlier, Julia was the one demanding answers while Brandon kept asking for patience, but now Brandon becomes the one asking whether she is still committed while Julia refuses to promise more than she genuinely feels. He wants reassurance that the legal consultation was only informational, that she has not filed anything, and that the marriage still has a chance. Julia tells him that no final divorce has happened, but she also refuses to pretend that not divorced means everything is fine. She explains that there is a huge difference between a marriage that is legally intact and a marriage that is emotionally secure, and right now they only know the first part. Brandon wants to treat the absence of final papers as good news, while Julia treats it as a window in which they still have time to decide what they are actually saving. That is the twist nobody around them seems to understand. The relationship is not officially over, but it may already be operating under a deadline. Brandon proposes clearer separation between family influence and marital decisions, more transparent conversations about money, realistic breakdown of which assets or opportunities are current and which are only future possibilities, and space for Julia to build income that belongs to her independent goals. Those ideas sound encouraging, but Julia does not instantly melt because she has reached the point where promises only matter if they survive the next difficult week. She tells him she does not want a temporary burst of effort created by fear of divorce, because anybody can become attentive when the relationship is about to collapse. What matters is whether Brandon still supports her independence when it no longer feels like an emergency, and whether he can discuss money without turning every question into a test of loyalty. Brandon agrees, but he also sets a boundary of his own. If they stay together, divorce cannot become the weapon they reach for every time an argument becomes uncomfortable. Julia pushes back on the word weapon because she says considering divorce is not the same thing as using it to manipulate someone. She tells Brandon that there has to be room in a serious marriage to admit when the relationship is failing without being accused of betrayal simply for naming the possibility. Brandon accepts that, but he explains that hearing Julia discuss lawyers and independent plans while he still believed they were working through a normal rough period made him feel blindsided. For once, they are finally discussing the same problem at the same time, and that alone changes the tone. Julia admits she should have been clearer about why she wanted information, while Brandon admits he should not have allowed outside fears to turn her questions into accusations. This is not a magical reconciliation, because neither person suddenly forgets what was said, but it is the first conversation where the 500,000 figure stops controlling the story and becomes what it always was, a symbol of everything they had failed to define together. The most revealing moment comes when Julia asks Brandon to describe their future without mentioning a dollar amount. No projected property value, no possible business worth, no potential opportunities, and no impressive total that makes tomorrow sound safer than today. She wants to know where they live, how decisions are made, what independence looks like for both of them, how much family influence is acceptable, what happens when one person wants a different path, and whether they can disagree without making the entire marriage feel unstable. Brandon struggles at first because numbers are easier than emotions. A financial target can be measured, while trust cannot. Eventually, he tells Julia he wants a marriage where neither person feels trapped, but he also wants a marriage where independence does not become emotional distance. Julia says that is exactly the problem they need to solve, because she does not want freedom from Brandon. She wants freedom inside the relationship. And this is where that supposedly shocking $500,000 secret finally loses some of its power, because the number was never a hidden fortune Julia suddenly discovered, never proof that Brandon was secretly wealthy, and never a guaranteed divorce settlement waiting to be divided. It was an optimistic combined picture of what their future might eventually become if several financial pieces worked out, but that projection exposed a marriage where two people had completely different definitions of safety. Brandon believed the future value proved they were building something worth protecting, while Julia believed the uncertainty underneath that value proved she needed something of her own. Neither position automatically makes one of them the villain. The real damage comes from assumptions both people thought had already been discussed when, in reality, they had been building two very different futures under the same marriage. But just when the money issue appears to be settling down, the divorce question becomes even more uncomfortable because Brandon wants an answer Julia is not ready to give him. He asks whether she intends to stay, not whether she is willing to talk, not whether she still loves him, but whether she is actually choosing the marriage. Julia hesitates again, and Brandon notices that she keeps answering questions about their relationship with conditions rather than certainty. She says she can choose him only if choosing him does not require abandoning the changes she now knows she needs. Brandon hears that as another warning, but Julia explains that she cannot go back to the version of their marriage where every disagreement ends with her eventually accepting the same situation because she is tired of fighting. If they stay together, staying has to create something different. That is where Brandon finally realizes the uncomfortable position he is in. For so long, Julia was the person waiting for the next stage, waiting for more independence, waiting for decisions, waiting for the future they had talked about, but now Brandon is the one waiting. He is waiting for Julia to decide whether his promises are believable. He is waiting to see whether the woman sitting across from him still sees him in her future. He is waiting for an answer that cannot be forced, because demanding reassurance would only prove Julia's point that she needs room to make choices without pressure. The emotional balance has shifted, and Brandon clearly feels it. Julia, meanwhile, does not look completely relieved by having more control. That matters, because if she were simply looking for an excuse to leave, this moment would feel easy. Instead, every independent decision comes with another emotional cost. She can imagine having her own place, her own money, her own schedule, and complete control over her future. But imagining those things also means imagining Brandon no longer being part of her everyday life. She does not suddenly stop caring about their history simply because she is frustrated, and that makes the decision much harder than choosing between a good marriage and a bad marriage. She is choosing between a familiar relationship that would require serious changes and an unfamiliar life, where she would finally have the independence she has been demanding. Brandon tries to reach her emotionally instead of financially. He stops talking about values, projections, property, and what they could have several years from now, and asks Julia to remember why they chose each other before all of those complications became part of the marriage. Julia listens, but she does not let nostalgia solve the problem. She says memories can explain why two people stayed together this long, but memories cannot make the next 5 years work. Brandon looks hurt by that response, yet it may be one of the most important things Julia says, because she is forcing both of them to stop using their past investment as proof that the future automatically deserves another chance. Then comes the question viewers would probably be screaming at the screen by this point. If neither one of them has finalized anything, why does everything feel like they are already divorced emotionally? The answer seems to be that the marriage is sitting in a dangerous middle ground. They still care, they're still talking, they're still discussing changes, and neither has fully closed the door, but their conversations are no longer about minor adjustments.